Hello and welcome back to the World History Project. I'm Wood Boyles, and today we're asking, why should we study decolonization and the Cold War together? We've just studied how the first half of the 20th century was dominated by two huge wars, World War I and II. There hasn't been a global conflict of that type since, and for good reason. Think about the nuclear capabilities of the superpowers that came out on top after World War II. A direct conflict between, say, the United States and Russia would just end in something called mutually assured destruction, or MAD, which would basically be the end of the planet. But even though we haven't had a world war since 1945, there is a lot of continuity between the two halves of the last century. In particular, the way in which the Second World War ended was a trigger for two other big changes that occurred after 1945. These two big changes are the Cold War and decolonization. The Cold War was an indirect conflict between the two powers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. Decolonization was the process where most of the world's colonies became independent states. We're especially talking about countries in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The Cold War and decolonization seem to be quite different in many ways, but I want to talk about how they were actually connected to each other. They were both occurring at the same time and were both products of the Second World War. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the two biggest winners. Germany, Japan, and Italy were of course the biggest losers. Technically, Britain, France, China, and a bunch of other good guys were winners too, but they had lost a lot of their industrial capacity and were essentially bankrupt. The cost of the war for Britain, France, and other states with empires made them weak. And when their colonies wanted independence, they were unable to really do much about it. The independence movements in those colonies were often led by men who had fought for Britain or France in the war. And now they believed that they deserved the right to govern themselves. But none of this really proves that decolonization was tied to the Cold War. So what does? Well, take for instance documents of Russian and American diplomats that talk about supporting or opposing independence in certain states because it will help them in their Cold War struggles. For example, the Soviet Union was eager to support independence movements in the Caribbean in the hopes that the new leaders would be anti-American. And similarly, when historians look at evidence from those groups struggling for independence in Africa, Asia, or elsewhere, they often find those leaders discussing whether or not to ask the United States or the Soviets for support. I should clarify that the Soviet Union was made up of Russia and a bunch of allies it had taken over basically during World War II. Considering that there is no Soviet Union anymore, I guess that kind of spoils the ending a bit. I mean, we know who wins. Anyways, our word of the day is decolonization. Decolonization is the political process by which a colony becomes a self-ruling, independent, and sovereign state. Most of the world's colonies became independent between, say, 1945 and 1990. But some people still debate whether or not they are really decolonized. Some former colonies remain poorer and economically dependent on industrialized societies, which I would argue is still a form of colonization today. So I want you to read End of Empire in the Cold War in Lesson 7.4 on Khan Academy. Look for the way that the author argues there are connections between these two trends. What evidence is he using to support his case? After you've read, answer this in your historian's journal. Has the Cold War really ended? The Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, and the Cold War supposedly ended. But this has not ended the territorial ambitions of Russian or U.S. leaders. Look at the United States and Afghanistan, and the continued policing of the world. Look at Russia's annexation of the Crimea and its attacks on Ukraine. We sometimes still hear countries today referred to as third world countries, which was a negative term used during the Cold War for decolonized countries that were not directly influenced by the Americans or the Soviets. Powerful countries today are still trying to influence weaker countries, and several still have colonies across the world. Other states are still trying to develop nuclear technology and arsenals. So, has the Cold War really ended? Or have the players just changed? You decide for yourself. See you next time.